Welcome to another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Peter B. Collins in San Francisco. Back in December, Dr. Jeff Kaye broke a story that is still pretty much undercover in terms of mainstream media coverage. Dr. Jeff Kaye is a retired psychologist who's been practicing journalism over the last 10 or 15 years, and he's covered a lot of fascinating stories, and he does deep dives into archive documents and things of that nature. And in December of 2018, at his Medium blog, he published an article with a pretty astounding claim that there was not a single CIA torture program. There were, in fact, two that emerged after the events of 9/11. Dr. Jeff Kaye, it's always good to talk with you. Thanks for being with me today.
Hi, Peter. Thanks very much for asking me on.
And before we dive into your important reporting here, I want to note for our listeners that there is a feature film that Netflix will be releasing in the near future. It's called The Torture Report, and it stars Annette Bening playing the role of Senator Dianne Feinstein. Adam Driver, John Hamm, and other major stars are in the film. It's written and directed by Scott Z. Burns. And I'm very curious to see how this portrays the work of the Senate Intelligence Committee under Senator Feinstein, laboring for years and finally producing, but not releasing, a 6,500-page report on the use of torture by the U.S. government in the early years of the Bush administration. And I point this out, Jeff, because I'm concerned that the movie will push out a narrative that many people will find credible, and it will Hollywoodize the actual facts and kind of lock them in the way the film Zero Dark 30 did, about 7 or 8 years ago.
Yes. Well, Peter, I share your concern, although the Zero Dark 30 was meant to promote CIA torture and the idea that you could advance your career in the CIA by being a torturer, which turned out to be true, as we saw with Gina Haspel. But this new movie, The Record, I don't want to say too much because until I see it, I don't want to condemn it. It could be very good. But I suspect with the participation of the primary author of the Senate report, which was Daniel Jones, as the main character in his collaboration with the filmmakers, that his narrative is what will be presented. And it is really a partial narrative. Now, whether that's due to, well, in my articles, as we may go into here, it became clear to me that the CIA did, in fact, lie to Congress or withhold information from Congress, so that the kind of narrative that they built had to be partial in any case. Now, if they present a narrative that shows that we're in the dark, but we're trying, and this is what we did, I could respect that. And there's certainly a lot of things that were revealed in that document, in that work. But if they say this is the truth and leave it as that's it, that's the narrative, then we're going to be frozen out in the dark about a lot of things that really happened.
And Jeff, I share your concern. At the same time, as an optimist, I hope that the film called The Torture Report may be a point of embarkation for people who've never paid attention to the issue to delve into it, and maybe the film will pique their interest to the point they say, well, I want to know what the real story is. And, did the CIA spy on the Senate intelligence staffers illegally? Was it a constitutional crisis? And Dan Jones was clearly at the center of that fight. And so, I hope that we will see accurate depictions of the events and the parties, and that it might be a film that provokes people to challenge the history of torture, and if only to bring out issues related to the current CIA director, Gina Haspel, whose confirmation process did not expose her full biography. And we'll talk about your subsequent report following the December report on Gina Haspel's being identified as being at 3 different CIA black sites where torture did occur. So with that, let's dive into your report, because you took a look at various documents, including some that were released by the ACLU in 2018, and information about the Chief of Medical Services at the CIA's Office of MS. I get lost in the acronym, so
Office of Medical Services.
Thank
yes.
you. And you have been able to piece together enough information to substantiate your observation that there was not a single rendition and torture program. So to help our listeners, we're going to refer to the one that people know about as Program A. That's the Rendition, Detention, and Interrogation Program. And then Program B, which we'll detail in a little bit, came out of a separate office at the CIA. So first, explain to our listeners the source of the documents that led you to this reporting.
Well, the primary documents that I've been reading for a long time, and there's so many documents, but the primary documents in this case would be the Senate, in fact, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, or rather its executive summary, which is what we have made public, that was released a few years ago. That is the matter for the background for this movie that's coming out by Netflix. And this other memoir, really, or by the director, we don't know his name, of the Office of Medical Services, of his years. It was written in 2007, of his, experience up to that point in the CIA rendition and detention and interrogation or torture program. And the memoir is amazing because, of course, the doctors think very highly of themselves. And this guy obviously felt very highly of himself. And he was going to defend himself against those, because by 2007, a certain amount of information had leaked to the press, and there were a lot of people writing in the mainstream media, New York Times, the Washington Post, McClatchy, about torture. And this was a defense of sorts of his work and the work of his team in OMS, defending their work in that program and trying to make clear what he felt were incorrect assumptions being made about what these doctors, CIA doctors, did. And the key event that they talk about, well, although he goes a lot into the initial origins of the program, we'll call Program A, with Abu Zubaydah, and talks about this report, by the way, made the press when it was revealed that for a time they were considering the use of truth drugs as part of the program. That did break through the press, although the discussion of it in the press was very limited. And the death of Gul Rahman, your viewers might think it's Rahman, but it's pronounced Rahman, R-A-H-M-A-N, who died at a prison called sometimes the Dark Prison or the Salt Pit, or in documents that have been released, it's called Detention Site Cobalt. And in this...
it was in Afghanistan, adjacent to the Bagram Air Base, right?
Yes. And, he died there in November 2002. If you read now I was, perturbed when this report first came out, the Senate report, because in it, I like to sort of skip to the footnotes and the appendices where I find the real information usually comes out. And in a very late appendix in the Senate release of their torture report is a back and forth between Senator Carl Levin and CIA Director Hayden. And Levin is incredulous. He's talking to Hayden, and they're talking about Gul Rahman, and he says, all right, so you have this program going on. Did anybody die in this program? He thinks he knows the answer, so he asks it, and Hayden says no. And he goes, not even one person died? Like, come on, tell us about Gul Rahman. It was terrible. He goes, no, nobody died. We are aware that somebody did die while in CIA custody, but not our program. Our program was the very highly disciplined, and this was undisciplined behavior. Brockman was not even part of the program, but I do understand he was in CIA custody. And so if you hear this or read this and you think, what in the world is he talking? It just sounds like double talk. And I'm sure that's how the senators thought of it. But in fact, he was telling the truth, kind of. I mean, he was keeping a card up his sleeve, which was, we had this other program.
Yeah.
Program B, we'll call it, as you say, which wasn't highly regulated, which did not have doctors present, which used so-called standard interrogation techniques instead of enhanced interrogation techniques, and which has hardly ever been discussed. And if it hadn't been for the death of Gul Brockman, which has kept a focus, and the lawsuit that's been done by his family and the works of groups like the ACLU to keep Brockman's story alive, because even still to this day, it's not clear we know the whole truth about it. His body has disappeared. So there can not even be an autopsy. His family never even got the body from the CIA. So anyway, when this new document came out from the chief of the Office of Medical Services explaining the origins of the enhanced interrogation program, which we call Program A today, and then revealed that there was another program, well, it illuminated much that had been obscure in the discussions and the documents around CIA torture. I'm not going to say that it totally explains everything, because there's a lot of new questions that arise around it. But it's an aspect of how the CIA program operated that's very important and needs to be out there.
So, Jeff, let me try to understand this with a quote from your article. The program known as the Rendition, Detention, and Interrogation Program, we're calling it Program A for our discussion today, operated as a special mission or special access program within the Special Mission Division of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. What we're calling Program B was run out of the Counterterrorism Center, but apparently under a completely different silo. So to the extent you're able to divine, are there people who were at the top of the organizational chart at the Counterterrorism Center who would have known about both programs but kept them separate and stovepiped in terms of the compartmentalization of the people who actually participated in the delivery of rendition and torture?
Well, yes, the Special Mission Division, which you mentioned, which was in fact is a division within, it's a division within the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, sometimes called CTC. I try and stay away from acronyms as much as I can.
Well, you do a better job than I do.
And we'll see. This oftentimes it's not clear. It was highly compartmentalized, so a lot of people at CTC and within CIA didn't even know about this program. So they could honestly, of course, report things that they didn't, they thought were the truth, when in fact it wasn't the whole truth. The Program A, the Enhanced Interrogation Program, originated out of a totally different office. Its authority and its management, day-to-day management, fell under the Special Mission Division, but it heavily relied for staffing and apparently for even the ideas of how to proceed from a totally different office in the CIA, very important, known as the Office of Technical Services. And the OTS, and that is an acronym everyone should know. In fact, they may know if they read, because there's been articles over the years highlighting this aspect of the CIA, because it's the gee whiz James Bond, highly technical, high tech, device kind of, dart guns and, race cars with cannons perhaps out of the headlights and assassination devices. It's a gee whiz kind of division as it's presented to the public, who even celebrated publicly its 50th anniversary in the press and everything. But it also was, it's otherwise known for being the part of the CIA that for many years ran the MK Ultra program, the CIA's mind control program that spent millions and millions and millions of dollars on how to control human behavior, and it was the one that famously used LSD drugs on people, and brainwashing and all of this. And the group of psychologists within the CIA, with the office of what this OMS or this chief of OMS report made clear was that a part of the part of the CIA that created the enhanced interrogation program, Program A, were people who were super keyed into MK Ultra. I will read to you just myself, where he says, the antecedents of this unit, meaning the unit that created the enhanced interrogation techniques, had overseen much of the MK Ultra interrogation research in the 1950s and 60s, published still relevant classified papers on the merits of various interrogation techniques, and contributed heavily to a 1963 Hubbard Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual and its derivative 1983 Human Resources Manual, and they assisted directly in early interrogations. When they say interrogations, we mean interrogations with torture. Mm-hmm. The Kubark Manual, which Kubark, what does that name mean? It's just the CIA's own name for itself. It's an acronym for itself. Yeah.
Jeff, you've touched on something that has puzzled me for a long time. We know that the CIA paid over the years some $80 million to Mitchell and Jessen. You mm-hmm. report that Mitchell was actually hired to produce a monograph before 9/11, which I find pretty fascinating.
Yes.
And so the accounts that we have are that Mitchell and Jessen took the established SERE program, that stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape, the way we train our troops. We try to harden them to be able to resist torture and interrogation. And the narrative is that Mitchell and Jessen reverse engineered the SERE programs to find the vulnerabilities that would work to crack jihadis and get them mm-hmm. to tell us about the next terror attack. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I've always been suspicious of that narrative because the CIA has a long history of torture and mm-hmm. of producing educational materials through the School of the Americas on how to help regimes that we are friendly with develop torture programs. And so I don't understand why the CIA felt the need to spend $80 million plus to reverse engineer SERE when in their own archives, as you point out, the Kubark memos and documents going back decades were right there.
Yes. And including, as you say, many, yes, exactly. Of course they were there. And I don't believe that narrative, and I haven't for a long time. In fact, the more I think about it, Mitchell and Jessen were ops guys. Mitchell in particular. These are guys who went out and did ops. They would go out with special forces. They got training in interrogation techniques, which, by the way, also came out all this time. The Senate report. James Mitchell has no experience in interrogations. And yet the report reveals, and I've talked to some various people about this, and they had never heard of this. The report reveals a lot. This report is maybe one of the most important. The OMS released by this doctor gives us far greater insight into the internal workings of the CIA around torture than any document, I believe, that's ever been released thus far. So one of the things that it tells us reveals is that at psychology conferences, which happened annually for the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency, which was people who ran SERE being the military survival training, torture survival test that was given to many, many people in the military and the intelligence services and State Department, secret agents and pilots and all sorts of things. That at these annual psychology conferences, there would be training done, or at least some of them, in interrogation. That the SERE psychologists and any other person, medical or psychological personnel, were were not just trained to help people who were released from POW, from incarceration by enemies of the United States, which is its stated purpose, but in fact had also been used to train people to participate in interrogations. And how far back this, and in fact, if you go back to the Vietnam War, there were, I could go into this, but special forces personnel, high-ranking, testified at tribunal, the Bertrand Russell Tribunal, for instance, at the time, that in fact, yes, survival training, this torture training was used to tell people how to torture people. It was to, in fact, give them advice on training. Mitchell, so yes, this story falls apart. And it also falls apart for a long time. I read the documents and it would say, yes, Mitchell and Jessen did reverse engineering along with other OTS personnel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, who are these other OTS personnel or psychologists? Well, one of them might be Kirk Hubbard, their boss, Mitchell and Jessen's boss, who ran them through the Operational Assessments Division of the Special Missions Division of the CIA, right? And they were, and they showed up at a lot of different places that I've documented in various articles that I've done. So it's not just one article that I'm relying on. I want your audience to know, but I've read long and deep into the reports, the documents surrounding this, and just as the CIA interrogators themselves use what they call a mosaic development, where they piece together the puzzle, really, the mosaic of different things. That's what I've been doing. Mm-hmm. And you can put together, of course, you have to test the reliability and validity of each piece of information that you get, just as the interrogators do. And I think I do a better job than they do. And I think,
let me test your mosaic this way, Jeff.
Okay.
And let me just acknowledge for our listeners' benefit that you're dealing in a whole arena where you have to expose secrets. And so the fact that you may not be able to piece together everything doesn't mean that what you have pieced together is not relevant or significant. But
right.
I want to just reference the two most egregious renditions that we are aware of. And I want to stress that we may not be aware of things that went even further astray or awry. But the case of al-Masri, which was a mistaken identity case, and the other one is Abu Omar, who was plucked in a botched raid in Milan, Italy, in broad daylight, where the CIA had 25 people on the ground, and they violated their agreements with the Italians in terms of surveillance of Abu Omar, and they popped him and renditioned him to Egypt, where they knew he would be tortured. So are you able to figure out if al-Masri and Abu Omar were the targets of Program A or Program B?
Well, I don't know about Abu Omar, since he was renditioned and sent to a foreign. That's one of the questions we have, is exactly what the agreements were with the foreign intelligence agencies. Which of them were read into this highly classified Program A, which was about, at its basis, I argue in the article, not about getting information, but about testing and these kinds of interrogation techniques, testing them in a scientific way, looking at both psychological variables and physiological variables, so that they could understand more about torture for their own purposes, to gain generalizable knowledge about torture. So it's science, but it's what you might call black science, right? In the case of al-Masri, though, we do know, because he was sent to the salt pit. He was sent to Afghanistan. He was part of Program B. Interestingly enough, just the other day, I was re-looking again at the January 2003 set of instructions from Tenet about interrogation techniques, guidelines on interrogations, conducted pursuant to this presidential memorandum back in September 2001 after 9/11. And I was looking at the most recently declassified version, but there was an earlier classified version, the declassified version released, which had more redacted. And what they were redacted was that in what we call Program B, they redacted that there's certain so-called standard, not enhanced techniques, were also used during transportation, meaning during rendition. Mm-hmm. So there were two, the rendition program could take people, so-called high-value detainees, into the enhanced interrogation program, Program A, where they were subjected to highly structured torture, highly structured interrogation, which utilized torture techniques that were which were constantly monitored by medical personnel on the scene who kept a record of all of this. Mm-hmm. Or they could be sent to the other Program B detention center, in this case the salt pit in Afghanistan, where they were subjected not to enhanced techniques, but to so-called standard techniques, which supposedly did not incorporate significant, quote-unquote, physical or psychological pressures, but which used, besides all forms of questioning allowed by military interrogators otherwise, you would use isolation, sleep deprivation, reduced caloric intake, meaning they partially starved them, use of loud music or white noise, not enough to damage their eardrums, but enough to drive a person crazy, and strangely, the use of diapers for certain periods of time, not to exceed 72 hours, meaning that, they were going to humiliate you, they were going to, and these are just the ones we know of, mm-hmm. right? We know from other reports of detainees that, of course, there were beatings. We suspect there were use of drugs. There was the rectal rehydration. In his book, James Mitchell says, I don't know what this rectal rehydration stuff is. I never did it. That was not part of the program. Mm-hmm. Look for it. You won't find it. It's not in there. I didn't do it. It's ridiculous. It may be, but that's what was done. Now, he could, of course, be lying. But I do believe that, many of the more egregious forms of, they're all egregious, but of the new egregious forms that were revealed were part of the so-called Program B standard techniques.
Now, Jeff, right? It occurs to me that there had to be somebody who had the authority to direct traffic. And this would be at the top of the ranks of the Counterterrorism Center. And it would be somebody who gets a report from the field. We're about to grab this guy. Where are we going to send him? And somebody had to make that decision whether they go to door number A or door B. It occurs to me that very well could be Gina Haspel.
Gina Haspel, Jose Rodriguez, Kofor Black, and George Tenet, who, of course, isn't per se CTC, but who was the director, right, mm-hmm. of the Central Intelligence. These people would be the top that I know of at the moment. Oh, another guy, I'm still, my research is ongoing, but who I believe was probably involved was, what's his name? The guy. Now I'm blacking out on his name. The guy who was some researchers identified as being involved, Blees or Bees, involved in the hiding some of the stuff.
Rich Blees,
Rich
I think
Blees,
is the name.
Yes,
mm-hmm.
is another guy. Mm-hmm. I would throw him in with that other group.
Okay. In a subsequent report, you are able to piece together from different sources strong evidence that Gina Haspel was at a black site at Guantanamo and described as chief of base, so she was the boss. Mm-hmm. And this was around 2003 or 2004. We have previous reports that she was at the black site in Thailand, mm-hmm. And the reports indicate that she was there after waterboarding occurred. Perhaps more waterboarding did occur. That was al-Nashiri, right? Mm-hmm. And then the third sighting places her in Poland. Is that correct?
Right. Yes. Well, Carol, the stuff about Gina Haspel in Thailand, I'm not sure who first reported on that, but it came out, and prior to the hearings, the congressional hearings, so it was already clear to the people to the Senate inquisitors that they knew that she was involved in torture, and they just took her word. Now, how much they really knew about, well, she was just there. It was less than a month. She was sent. What was she supposed to do? She actually was kind of against it. Whatever. And I'll never torture again. But in fact, they were hiding, as you say, some of her other activities around this. It was Carol Rosenberg, I believe, a reporter at Miami Herald, who first saw that in a document that was released as part of the military commissions during a hearing, highly redacted, and yet it came out in the discussion that Gina Haspel had been chief of base at the CIA black site at Guantanamo, which was shut down in 2003 or 4. It's unclear to me. Well, no one knows exactly when it was shut down, and people were moved out, people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and others, Abu Zubaydah. And but also what overlooked in that document, I was very pleased that this was released and that this kind of work was done. And of course, unlike most people, I went and actually read the document, the whole document that it came from, and was surprised to see that not only had she been at the Guantanamo black site, but she had also been at the black site, according to this document, in Poland. And that furthermore, the attorneys, the military commission defense attorneys involved who were quoted to this effect in the document, which is still highly redacted, were trying to get this information to Congress and were being denied. Because, of course, the attorneys can't say anything. The military commission defense attorneys can't really say anything for fear of releasing classified information and getting into a whole lot of trouble, legal trouble. So they don't. But in this document, that was declassified. And while the fact that it's kind of a curse I have lately, I've noticed, despite the fact that her presence at the Guantanamo black site was reported widely, just as it's been widely reported that she was in at the Thailand Cat's-Eye CIA black site prison. Nobody else but myself has reported that she also is at the Poland black site. Yes. That's 3, sort of like 3 strikes and you're out. This woman was a major player in the torture program, which is not how she was presented at the congressional hearings. And as you're inferring, perhaps as well, was involved from some other evidence. And I think one reason the Poland site is not being talked about is because it brings up a lot of questions about legal culpability as it presently exists in this world, because Poland is, unlike the United States, a member of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, and they are mandated as such to prosecute people for things like this. And just recently, the European Court of Human Rights legitimated the fact that Abu Zubaydah and al-Nashiri, whose attorneys had filed suit about their imprisonment in the black sites in Poland and Lithuania, were awarded special status for being torture victims, and were the United States, or excuse me, the states of Poland and Lithuania were supposed to pay them 100,000 euros each for what they suffered as their liability for their participation in the torture program by allowing the CIA to set up these bases.
Right.
So if Gina Haspel was at the site in Poland. See, Guantanamo is outside the law, is to quote a book that was written about Guantanamo. In Thailand, for all intents and purposes, is too, because it's kind of run by a puppet government for the United States. But Poland is not supposed to be that way. Yeah. And so but why other press wouldn't report this? And I tried to make it known as widely as possible, is disturbing to me. Well, it means there's a wider collaboration in withholding information about the CIA program than I would like to imagine there should be.
Well, Jeff, I'm happy to amplify the story that you have broken here. But it is a shameful note that the corporate media in this country has not picked up on it at all and appears to have no interest in digging into the grisly history of torture, Guantanamo, and the related matters. And as we wrap up, Jeff, I want to note another important thread in this article that you've published, you establish, again, by comparing Program A to Program B, that Program A essentially involved very tightly orchestrated, scientific-based experimentation on human beings. And
Yes.
that we have a historic parallel here to Dr. Joseph Mengele and the experiments that he conducted on Jewish prisoners during the Holocaust. And
Yes.
I think it's really important to underscore this because, as you point out, at a certain point, the Inspector General is saying, hey, we want to know if these torture techniques work. And then they kind of drew back saying, well, gosh, if we do that, we're creating a record of human experimentation. And so then they adopted a kind of a third way by calling it quality control.
Yes.
And this bends the mind in a very dark direction, that we would have doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists who are there taking notes as we inflict pain and humiliation and torture on a subject. And then they would file reports and figure out ways to do it even better on the next victim. And this kind of sordid exploitation of science and knowledge and systems is something that I think needs to be sharply repudiated, and we have to acknowledge that President Obama took no steps to expose or prevent a repeat of this dark cycle of American history.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad that you brought that up. It is really the core argument that I'm making. That I believe is important, is that the way to understand this torture program, Program B, the standard interrogation program, is something done by many countries around the world. The CIA is part of it. It's not extraordinary in that sense, but only in the sense that the United States puts itself forward as something better, and it's not. But the other program, and this is what speaks to that upcoming Netflix movie, is it going to reveal that really at the core of this program was a diabolical research program to look at, to study, in fact, torture, and to do experiments about torture on individuals. It goes against the Nuremberg principles. It goes against law, international and domestic. And it's frightening to think that this is what's at the heart of our government, are these Nazi-like secret research programs. I mean, it sounds like something out of, wild conspiracist fantasies. But then so did MK Ultra, and that was all true.
Yeah.
And the discussion breaks forth once in a while around this issue of the effectiveness of torture techniques. And one of the interesting findings in this document that I found was that, oddly enough, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen argued against these kinds of research because they felt it would be, you couldn't do it, that it's impossible really to research. And actually, the only thing I agree with them on is this: it's impossible to research torture for various reasons. Mm-hmm. And not the reasons necessarily they said, although the ones they said are also true, which had to do with the methodology of it, not the morality of it, or the legality of it. But it's important. Obviously, we don't have time to go into all the reasons and facts that back up why I'm saying that there was a research program, but it is there in the article. I've reported on it elsewhere and at other times, where you can I found scattered references to like being read into the program for research for detainees, as I found, in another spot, not reported in this article, but in other writings that I've had. But it's, and also the Washington Post, as I do note in my article at medium.com, is on Program A and Program B that, the contracts that Mitchell and Jessen had were not to do interrogation; they were to conduct research. Yeah, and those contracts were revealed by the Washington Post just last year, I believe. So, that's what we have here, and it's really a challenge. Is what is this society going to do about it? And I thank you very much for giving me a platform and taking on yourself this issue, because it's very, very important to our democracy and to our culture.
Well, there's no pleasure in it, but I appreciate your comment, and I want to thank you for staying with us. Most people have moved on, and they consider Guantanamo and these egregious practices as part of a past chapter. But with the current president, these could be resuscitated at any time, and perhaps they already have, and we don't know it. With Gina Haspel at the helm of the CIA, we have to remain vigilant and skeptical. Jeffrey Kaye, I do appreciate your in-depth research and reporting on these issues, and I look forward to your future dispatches.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thanks for listening to this podcast interview with Dr. Jeff Kaye. Send your comments to peter@peterbcollins.com. And I'd appreciate it if you could make a contribution to support the great investigative journalism work here at Who, What, Why.